Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and we're here with Writing for Your Life and Compassionate Christianity. And I'm so happy because we have Suzanne Nadell here, and she is a alum of a Writing for Your Life event. And we were just talking. We met 2 years ago in Atlanta, and she had this book that she was visioning and working on, and now it is being published. So congratulations and welcome, Suzanne. The name of Suzanne's book is Wired to Lead, Being the Leader the Church Didn't Think You Could Be. And explores a lot about, in particular, women's roles in the church and how women's leadership is defined both in the marketplace and in church roles. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for being here. Before we talk about your book, it would be awesome if you could just tell us a little bit more about your background. I know just briefly, I should say for those who are listening, Suzanne is a TV journalist and has a quite accomplished career in that domain. And again, I think this is your first book. So you talk a lot about your career as a journalist and how that relates to your experience sort of vis-a-vis church ministry. So, but again, before we talk about your book specifically, can you just tell us more about your background, your work, and sort of how you got to this place in your journey? Thanks and welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And it's so good to connect with you again. So, yeah, you know what? My background and leading into the book and all of that, it's really all connected because, our stories really are our life stories, right? So, I am a preacher's kid. I grew up in rural America. In a very conservative church upbringing. I was not super conservative, but definitely leaned more conservative, not technically evangelical, but closer to evangelical than not. And so that really shaped and formed my upbringing and how I viewed what I could and couldn't do. I'm the oldest kid in my house, grew up in a parsonage. Lovely parents. I always want to say, please don't get anything that I say in the criticisms of the book or my upbringing to. I have two parents who love Jesus and love people and were great examples, but what they taught in their church definitely formed my background. So I fell in love with TV news, watching 2020 with my dad on Friday nights. Ended up going to a Christian college, thinking I would probably, in the back of my mind, get an MRS degree because that's what happens when you went to a Christian college. Part of the reason, even though I said I was not going to marry a minister, I did not want to be a preacher's wife, and really ran with the news thing. And the news world is a world that completely embraced me. I've spent 30 years in TV journalism, everything from a started as a production assistant to an associate producer, a reporter, a producer, an executive producer, and then news director. So that journey has taken me across the country. And in 19 years in managing newsrooms and different management roles, 12 of that being the person in charge of the newsroom. And yeah, married a guy in the business, and we have a son. And that's my background and how I ended up here so far.
Well, great. And as you said, this leads directly into your book. And you sort of talk about these tensions that you felt growing up and sort of as you launched your adult life in your career and your personal life. So can you tell us, maybe just give us an overview of the book? What's it all about?
Yeah, so I always say kind of the best explanation of the book was my working title. My working title of the book was Life Lessons I Learned in the Newsroom That I Wish I Learned in Church. And that kind of really sums it all up. Basically, as I flourished in leadership in newsrooms and my faith grew with that, there was almost this resentment that started settling. Like, why was I not allowed to lead in churches and come up in the way I was allowed to in a newsroom? And in some of my circles, it would still, like, kind of show up sometimes. And then I've had some health journeys, and both time I went through those health journeys, I just felt this nudge, like this, and it just kept on getting louder with age. That, you know what, you need to use this story to like ignite some folks, because at the end of the day, Well, I do believe God wanted me in newsrooms, and I was able to reach a lot of people in newsrooms. It's kind of a shame that I had to learn these life lessons outside of the church because of my gender. And wouldn't it have been awesome if I, as a young girl who was wired to lead, which is a phrase that I talk about in the book I got from my dad when we were having the debate at one point. I'm like, hey, I'm your kid that has the preacher's gene. And he's like, you're wired to lead. I'm the one who's wired to lead, like my dad, who has led. I mean, my dad is in his mid 70s and is just now stepping down from the pulpit. And and it became, and what the book really is a call to embrace young women and women who are wired to lead in the church. And I don't think it's necessarily just for super conservative, congregations and denominations that haven't embraced women to the extreme, because I think also in even in other areas and denominations and stuff, there's still not equality with women and who's at the table, and there's still tension there. And it's tension that we've addressed in the workplace, and that we haven't really addressed in the church world and in faith circles as much. And how do we address that tension? So that's the first part. The second part is, it's kind of also a call to, journalists, we're not bad people. Like, these lessons that I learned in a newsroom align with faith. Like, when people are like, oh, wow, it must be tough to be a Christian and a journalist. No, it's not, because my what grounds me as a journalist and drives me as a journalist perfectly aligns with my faith. So there's a lot of behind the scenes looks into what kind of drives decisions in newsrooms and stuff. And some of the feedback I've gotten is that people really kind of enjoy that part of the book where they kind of see behind the curtain to some of those decisions and things that drive those conversations.
Well, that's great. And in addition, you open the book, your first chapter is about bias and implicit bias. And what as I was reading it, what I really got from it is that you're also a learner in this journey, as we all are. And you particularly call out the murder of George Floyd and other um, African Americans who were, who faced incredible violence, and sort of the wake up call that many of us had, who, were living through that time and doing, I think, new layers of self-reflection. So you talk about that and your own sort of journey of looking at bias. So can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how you're also, again, encouraging churches to step up and do a better job of looking at bias, and being sort of leaders in that way?
Yeah, it's interesting because in journalism world, there have been organizations like the National Association of Black Journalists, which is very active organization and has led conversations for a very long time. And it's an organization that will also call out newsrooms whenever they see wrongdoing and things done as well. But it's interesting when you talk to journalists in the time of George Floyd and all of those things, developing, as much as journalism and newsrooms had really driven having diversity at the table, many Black journalists and people of color would still tell you there are things they didn't say because they were, afraid to completely be themselves. And I will say, all of those things in 2020, I think, opened the conversation even more. I would think, somebody like me would have told you, oh yeah, we've got diversity at the table. It's not just diversity in ethnicity and background, is also in thought and personalities, and yes, we do that, but I think it really awakened folks to look at, no, some people are still holding back. And why is it that some people are still holding back? And how can we make sure people are comfortable? So, one of the things that I'm lucky enough, before DEI became the thing in 2020, I did have an organization. It was part of an organization that really drove making sure that our newsrooms and our newsroom management teams look like the cities we're in. I'm happy to say, I lead a newsroom. and more than half of my managers, head of editorial, the people under me, are people of color, as they should be in Atlanta, Georgia, because more than half of the people in Atlanta, Georgia are people of color. My managing editor is Black. All three of my executive producers are. My operations manager is. I have a Cuban American who is the manager of coverage and content. We have an Asian American who runs our special projects unit. I think I only have two white guys on my management team. But we reflect Atlanta. And we can't have conversations and do the stories that matter to people of Atlanta and Georgia if we don't understand what people in Atlanta and Georgia, are thinking. And the church can do better. I mean, if you look at how our church boards, how the leadership, the boards are, why is it that, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, that 11 o'clock is still one of the most segregated hours? It's because people go where they're comfortable and they don't have to watch what they're saying. And I think that's an area of improvement for the church when it comes to both gender and ethnicity, but also, just diversity in all kinds of thought and even how you approach things. Like, I don't need a bunch of managers under me that are like, talk fast, Energizer bunnies. I got that box checked. I need people who aren't like me to serve the people in our newsroom and in the city in the best ways that we can.
Well, thanks for that. And maybe we can pivot back to gender because I think you speak so searingly about some of the issues that are facing, that women face. And so, can you just talk about sort of what messages you hope the church will hear about your experience as a woman and sort of what your call to action is related to gender more broadly?
Yeah, in gender more broadly, I think it's first, and I've got a whole thing about this. It's like, let's not put our girls and our younger girls and our women in buckets. And I always think about every church I went to, the first place anybody wanted to put me was the kids ministry. I don't think a male executive walking in any church would be put in the kids ministry. Now, I'm really good at kids ministry and I always do the kids ministry. But what if I wasn't? I mean, that's the question. That's the question. And I think, where I think we kind of especially can bucket people in the churches too. Sometimes it's out of need, it's out of necessity. It's where you can put people. But look at our young women and our girls as we would our boys. And I would just ask in the church, are we having the same conversations with our boys that we're having with our girls? And with that, I would also say, how are we raising our boys in the church to empower women in the church and in all roles? I say there's a reason, and I write about this in the book that I ended up marrying somebody who was not a person of faith at the time. And because a lot of the guys I went to Christian college with, not all of them, there are many, for those who see this, you are a wonderful one. Uh, but but they're not nice, and they expect specific roles, and we could do a better job, and I believe in how we raise our boys and in what opportunities we give our girls. And I think that just comes to stopping some of the assumptions.
Well, that's great. Well, maybe we can pivot a little bit and talk about your writing life, because many of the people who tune in to writing for life are writers or aspiring writers, and of course they're readers. So they're always writers or readers, and readers are writers. Um, but maybe I want to ask you in a minute sort of what you've learned in the publishing journey, what surprises there have been or lessons learned. But before I ask you about that, I just want to note that you seem to have a really flourishing platform, what people that scary word that people talk about in writing, which is platform. And I follow you on Instagram and other channels, and what the vibe or the tone that I really get from you is as an encourager. You seem to just provide a lot of encouragement. And so maybe can you just talk a little bit about how you engage with people online? And am I right? Is that sort of is that, would you say that encouragement is kind of one of your main themes? And just talk a little bit about sort of how you strategically show up online to try to reach potential readers and others that you want to connect with.
Yeah.
And I ask this separate from your sort of day job as a journalist, of course.
Yeah, I think, when if I were to like describe my brand, which I know writers don't like to think of that, but you kind of do. Um, it is encouraging women who I would say are like me. And that goes to the book as well. And if I describe the book, I love a lot of the traditional Christian female writers. Love, like I could do a Beth Moore study any day. I love it. But so many of those things are not for the career Christian woman. And I wanted to put a book out there that was for someone like me. And when I talk about what I do, the encouragement, I would say I'm Suzanne, I'm a wife, mom, and TV news boss, and I juggle faith, family, and career. Like, I want to show up for the women who are juggling faith, family, and career, whatever that looks like for them, because and I mean, this is no disrespect for the women who, if this is their calling and where God wants them to be, but there's enough stuff for the stay-at-home moms, and there's enough of that over there, and I just felt like there's a void for women like me. I know there are a lot of women like me, and I want to encourage them. As I think about what I'm going to post every day, I think about how is it that I can make sure that women who are trying to juggle their faith and their family and their career, that they feel heard and they feel seen, because I think they often feel, I'll speak for myself, misunderstood and not seen and exhausted. We're exhausted. And how is it that we can manage that and know there are other folks like us out there?
Well, that's great. And again, another word that comes to mind is authenticity. I think you show up online in a pretty authentic way. And I would be curious if again, sort of how you try to manifest authenticity, which, can be hard when you're, doing an Instagram reel or something like that. But in particular, maybe you referenced briefly your health journeys a few minutes ago. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of your health history? I know you write about it in the book and you talk about it online, and sort of how that has contributed or been a part of you sort of showing up in sort of authentic ways.
Yeah, I've had cancer technically three times, two big ones. So both Hodgkin's lymphoma and breast cancer. I'm a BRCA2 gene carrier, and then I've had skin cancer, as well, which is actually linked to the BRCA2 gene that I have. Uh, this sounds like a downer when I say it, but I don't mean it as a downer. I actually mean it as something that really fuels my passion. I'm very aware of my mortality. I'm very aware that because of everything that I've been through, that I probably don't have a normal life expectancy. If I live to 90, great, great. But I'm very aware that life is precious, and do what you feel led to do. And if you're going to do something, go all in. And that's kind of my mantra. It's just, I realize that if it's worth doing, do it. Do it, with your heart, and be aware that we don't know what tomorrow holds. And again, I don't say that. Sometimes I'll say that and people are like, don't say that. Like, how could I'm like, I don't mean that in a depressed way. I mean that is in some ways I'm awakened, to the fact that life is precious and life is good. You know, and I've got to say the most times of comfort I've felt and peace and closeness to God have been when I've had cancer. It's people showed up, and part of us, I show up for people too, but it forced me to slow down. It forced me to listen. And I will say, after the second one, I started writing the book uh, a year and a half after the breast cancer journey. And I will say, since the breast cancer, I say flip. I've got 13 doctors. I mean, I really do have 13 doctors just because of my lovely genetic load. Um, and I've realized, you know what? I've felt this nudge for more than a decade now. I told my bosses whenever I got permission to write the book, and it goes, this transitions into the writing thing. And I have to do everything. I'm on a contract that protects, the brand of the station and our journalistic integrity and my commitments to the station, all of those kinds of things. And it came time, and somebody leading a newsroom writing a book like this is not traditional. And I was going to leave 3 years ago, and they're like, we want you to stay. And I was like, well, I've got to publish this book. I want to do this book. And I flatly said to my bosses, I said, if I am told you have cancer again, I would not regret. I said, I would not regret staying at the station. I would regret not getting this book out here. Like, I am called to get it out there. It's a non-negotiable. So if you want me, we got to figure out how I'm going to do this book thing. And we figured out how to do the book thing, which is part of my, journey into writing. I had a very untraditional writing and getting published path because of all of that. But it has fueled, it's given me a sense of purpose. And for anyone listening, if you're working on it and you felt that nudge, do it. There's a reason why you have that nudge. That's the spirit. There's the follow that nudge. And it's sometimes it's just getting it out on paper, and that's all you were supposed to do, and it feels good, but follow the nudge.
Well, that's great advice. And, I think as someone who's, also wrote a book while I was having a sort of busy career in a different domain, or, sort of adjacent but different domain, and the sort of anxiety I felt about that positionality, I think your story really resonates, and I'm glad that you had the support, and that you had the bravery to push for it. So before I let you out completely off the hook, though, are there other kind of, so once you got the permission, have you had any surprises along the way as you've been working on your book or seeking a publisher? Have you had any lessons learned? I know you gave some great advice just now about like following the nudge, but are there other pieces of advice or insight you've gleaned?
Yeah, for me, it was quite the journey. I was just the long story short, my journey of writing. Through 2020, I said I was going to write a book, and then I never really like. I bought a non-work laptop because I knew enough that I shouldn't do it on my work laptop, and I wrote like a chapter that didn't see the light of day. And finally, I reached out to another author who connected me with her kind of writing consultant coach who helped her write a book. And that's who I connected with. And it's so funny because at first I was like, do I get an attorney to make sure that, I'm allowed to write the book? What do I do? And she said, how about you just ask your bosses? Like, how about before you get all complicated, how about you just ask? And they were amazingly supportive. And it was a different kind of journey because usually nonfiction, you would write a few chapters and then you would do your proposal. But because part of the conditions of my contract and writing it were everything had to be approved, I went ahead and I wrote the whole thing. So I wrote the whole thing. It took about a year, and then got it approved. And I started just reaching out to made my own proposal and query and everything. And I got a nibble from I got a few nibbles um from the list, the Writing for Your Life list of like publishers that could align. Like I just like used that, went down, I remember. And so I got a call from a publisher, got a deal from a publisher. Then at the same time, I got a call from an agent who was a well-known agent. And she said, you know what, you could take that offer from the publisher, or you can work with me for a little while and I could see if we can, get something basically better. And, I got greedy or whatever. And so I worked with the agent, and she wasn't able to get anything. And I will say, shout out to this agent. I work with agents in TV world. I can tell you the agents that rep my anchors are not this generous. When she came back to me and she said, you know what, I didn't get anything better than what you had. You should go back to this publisher. You got that deal on your own. I'm not going to take any money from it. It's just that's your deal. And the publisher Chalice, which was they'd gone through some changes in the year and a half in the year that I hadn't talked to them. But they welcomed me back, gave me a new offer, which I actually think I like the way this offer actually ended up better anyway. And then it was we were going to do it like a year later, and they're like, you know what, we don't want you out in an election year, so pushed it to about now. So it was delay after delay, but God's timing. And I could see now why. I've sat on this book for like 3 years now. It's been done. Like sometimes I don't even remember what I wrote in it. Somebody asked me about the story. I was like, oh, did I write about that? But God's timing, it all works out. And I actually have had like a really good experience so far. It was not expected. I think when we talked, I had just said no to that publisher. And then I was like, I don't know what I like, first time author. And I actually got something from a publisher on my own. And I said no. I ended up back with them. And it's the head of that publishing house is a former journalist himself. So he actually completely understood like the vision, has been very supportive. So I appreciate how it's kind of all unfolded. Again, longer, much longer than I thought, but we got it done.
That's great. Well, it's funny. I've been hearing that as a theme of authors I've been interviewing, is just like how long the process takes. I interviewed Roger Hutchinson the other day, and he was talking about that with children's books too. And like, with a kid's book, you think it could be pretty quick, but still, no, it's like a couple of years. So, well, let's shift back again to talking about the content of your book. And I'm just struck by the subtitle, "Being the Leader the Church Didn't Think You Could Be." And, maybe at a high level, kind of what are the messages that you hope stick with land with the church, from your book and from sort of your personal experience, maybe since then? Um, how can the church be more responsive and welcoming and inviting to leaders of all different kinds, including women? Thanks.
You know, throughout the book, I give kind of like reflection questions to kind of, think about each area of the book. I set out in the book saying I'm not going to change anyone's mind on where they stand, if they're complementary and egalitarian, where they stand on women in the church, in the book. That's not my goal. But my goal is to give folks pause, and especially if they are already supporters of women, maybe to pause and think about blind spots that they still have, that have still diminished women's roles and women being able to use their full capacity in the church. That's kind of my whole thing. And whenever I say add some angst, it's it's are we giving women the same voice at the table? Are we giving them the same opportunities? And when we spot a woman who is wired to lead, are we approaching them in the same way that we are men? And I would also say for women too, I think women in the marketplace and the business world have learned to play better in the sandbox sometimes than women in the church world. And part of that is that women are a little, I think in the church world, we're a little further behind. And in a lot of churches, there are only a few seats at the table still for women. So it creates a dynamic. But as women and men, I just ask throughout the book in each chapter, are we approaching women and giving women the same seats and the same voice? And as we do that, my main target for this book is our girls coming up. How are we embracing them and the conversations we're having them to lead or do whatever it is that God wired them to do, to reach their full capacity, how God made them, wherever that leads them to be, and to not feel diminished, and to not feel quashed, and to not feel less than when they are doing nothing but just being themselves and being the way God wired them to be.
Well, amen, and thank you for that. Well, maybe can you just tell us where we can find you online, how we can connect with you and buy your book when it's going to be available. And yeah, and also, are you working on any new projects? Is there another book in the works or anything new coming up? So
Yeah. So online, my main platform, and I didn't get into this as much when you asked so quickly. Instagram, at Susan Nadell, and you'll find me there almost every day. And my advice for building a platform, it's just consistency. You just have to show up every day, and or whatever your pattern is, but show up consistently. And I started growing all of that social platform because after I wrote the book, everyone's like, okay, you've got some pretty good social stuff, but you gotta have that platform to get the traction that you want. And that's morphed into other things, so it's like kind of taken on a life of its own. So Instagram is the main place you'll find me at Susan Nadell. I do have a Facebook page, Suzanne Nadell, that you can find me there as well. And then my website, suzannenadell.com. I have a weekly newsletter that I have my blog. You can sign up for the newsletter at suzannenadell.com. That weekly blog just shares life lessons. So every week it's a life lesson. There you can find out what I'm up to, where you can see me speaking, preaching, or doing whatever I'm doing. But would love to connect with anyone at suzannenadell.com, where you can find the book anywhere books are sold. Chalice Press is my publisher. So their website, they've got a little deal right there. It's a little cheaper there if you want to go there. But then it's also Amazon, Target, Barnes and Noble, all of the book sites. You can find it there.
cool. Well, and you didn't answer the question about future projects, but maybe I can. Yeah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think you know what. I've got another book or two in me. I think again, continuing to tie some of the life lessons that I've learned in newsrooms. I think I really feel led to tackling darkness and how you find hope, which is something that people ask me all the time. They're like, you're somebody who obviously has a lot of hope and you're surrounded by a lot of ick in life with the newsroom. So I think there's a need for that. Um, as well as I feel led to doing something about like non-traditional marriages. I don't know, so I don't know where that's gonna go. But those are two things that looking forward to, but there is light in the world, and I want to really I think that will be the next project, and sometimes freeing up with some things that I'm doing. I think I'm going to dig into that one.
Well, that sounds great. Well, maybe just as a final question, this is a big one, so you can respond to it however you want. But you're talking about darkness, and I think in you said that your publisher didn't want you being published in an election year, and of course now we're in early 2025, and there's a lot of change and turmoil, and in particular, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really being challenged and sort of undermined in various ways. And so I'm just curious how you feel like your book can speak to this moment in time, sort of historically, and, or like sort of how you can, sort of what message sort of you hope will be a takeaway from your book. Again, that's a big question, but
Yeah, it is a big question, but you know what? And again, God's timing is always the best timing. I didn't think about everything that would be going on in the world and how a lot of people would be feeling in the world whenever it was released. I kind of actually feared that the time had passed because so much of what I talk about goes back to 2020 and 2021. And I know a lot of the discussions we have in the newsroom are around just how people feel right now. Um, and hearing all of those voices. So for and I will say, like, coming from the journalist background and like both sides and all of those kinds of things, I would say like I can tackle the book in two ways. I have a dear friend who read the book, and I love how she posted. She's like, you know what, read this. It can challenge your thoughts. So for some people, I hope the book challenges some thoughts, or at least, again, I'm not going to convince you. I'm not set out to change your mind on anything. That's not, I'm not a theologian. Uh, but think, like, I hope it makes you think, and I hope it makes you think like how Jesus led, and how Jesus invited people to the table, and what that all connects to. And then for those who feel like that their voice is quashed, I hope the book helps them realize nobody can quash your voice or make you be smaller than what God made you to be. And God did not create you to be small. He did not create you to have a quashed voice. So I think, there are two sides that I hope it speaks to.
Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. Again, this is Suzanne Nadell, and she just has is publishing her first book, Wired to Lead: Being the Leader the Church Didn't Think You Could Be. I'm so excited for you, and just excited that you've reached this point in your publication journey. So congratulations, and thank you for your words and your wisdom, and thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. All right. Best wishes, and keep us posted on how it goes. Thanks again.